Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today we are going to talk about genetically modified food and how this kind of food is being perceived by people, by consumers, and by policymakers and people in society at large. See, food is essential to produce energy to do work. So across all societies, everybody has to consume food in order that he or she gains energy to do some work. Different countries across the world have evolved different types of cuisine over the years. Over time, food processing, which is used to be located in the households and communities, slowly got industrialized. For example, US is an example where food processing has become industrialized and is labeled as industrial food. The food that comes out of this industries is called industrial food. However, food has become a cultural marker. For example, we keep talking about Italian cuisine, Indian cuisine. It means that each of these civilizations or cultures have evolved a particular way of processing food, cooking food, and consuming food. This is what we mean by food cultures. Each culture has evolved its own unique way of using materials that are used in cooking in different ways, adding different flavors, adding different colors, and so on. Ethics in production and processing of food has become an important issue in the context of genetic modification of food, about which we are going to discuss in this lecture. So, in this talk, I will firstly talk about what is GM food and then what kind of controversies and constraints it has raised, and what kind of regulation that we should have, a culture of regulation, and what is the kind of debate that we have in our country on genetic modification of food. And I conclude the lecture by making some concluding remarks. What is genetically modified food? Genetically modified food is that food produced from genetically modified seed or food that contains ingredients made from genetically modified plants, animals, or microorganisms. For example, genetically modified corn is an example of genetically modified food, because corn is used as food or intermediate in processing food and so on. Genetic modification involves transfer of genes from one organism belonging to one species of a taxonomic group to a food crop that belongs to a species of other taxonomic group. The source of these genes may be plant species, animal species, or microbial species like bacterium and so on. Example or BT corn. BT corn is a corn food crop into which a toxin producing protein from bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis has been introduced to protect the crop against pest attacks. The logic of gene transfer, the logic underlying the gene transfer is that the foreign genes inserted into the crop plant have some properties like production of a toxin that equips the plant to fight diseases and pest attacks, B, enhancing the yield, C, increasing tolerance against drought and salinity. The claim is that genetic engineering technology may be deployed to A, protect crop plants against diseases, that is called biotic stresses, and B, enhance the yield, and C, enhance tolerance against drought and salinity. These are what we call abiotic stresses. In the sense, in our country we have a variety of agroclimatic zones. We have irrigated areas, we have dryland areas, we have hilly areas. So, various agroclimatic zones are there in our country. So, these are the variety of situations we have in our country, and similarly Variety of crops are grown in our country, like wheat, rice and millet crops especially are grown in dryland areas, and several horticulture crops are also grown in our country, and each of these crops are subject to these biotic and abiotic stresses. Means each crop is vulnerable for some pest attacks, vulnerable for some diseases caused by bacterium, viruses, and also they are susceptible for drought. That means if there is no proper rainfall in a particular season, the crops will not grow, the crop loss will be very, very high. Similarly, in saline conditions, crop plants have to encounter a lot of salinity, which really affects the growth of these plants. In the sense that variety of contexts are there, and this genetic engineering is supposed to address problems of crop plants in all these different contexts. So, historically, if you look at the scientific knowledge and its production, the recent literature in sociology of scientific knowledge shows that earlier conception that science is morally neutral, disinterested pursuit, autonomous from wider society and culture is no longer tenable. In the sense, earlier people said science is done by a group of people whose work does not have direct bearing to society, in the sense it does not have anything to do with society. They are generating knowledge for its own sake, generating knowledge as an intellectual curiosity. But today this is no longer the case. Science is generated, most of the science is generated in order to solve some strategic problems, in order to solve some real world problems. So that is why the science gets connected with the society, its policies, the people, the farmers, the consumers and so on. So today the boundary between the internal world and the external world of science is porous. When we talk of internal world, we mean scientific theories, models, concepts and so on, which I said earlier were seen as if they are autonomous from the society, and external world includes culture, politics, society and economy. And earlier I said the science does not have any connection with these external institutions or external domains, but today it is no longer the case. Bruno Latour, he did some work on Louis Pasteur's research. Pasteur was the one who identified the cause of the disease, that the cattle were infected with, and this was anthrax. So what Pasteur did was he brought the samples of anthrax, samples of infected tissues of cattle to the laboratory in Paris and did research on them and isolated that the cultured tissues, and he found that anthrax was the cause of this disease. His work, Pasteur's work, created interest among farmers, governments, veterinarians and the press, because he brought the interest of the farmers, government, veterinarians and the press into the laboratory for solving the problem. So that is how the societal interest, the interest of farmers were brought over to the laboratory for further examination and testing. That is how the laboratory becomes connected with the land, or connected with people, connected with different sections of the society. And Pasteur's work proved that the division between science and society is not rigid, it is porous, and there is two-way traffic between society and science. Now, genetic engineering and external world, how genetic engineering is connected with the external world. Mapping genomes of organisms is not only to describe the genome, but also the functions of genes distributed over the chromosomes, so that the interventions can be evolved by engineering the genes. Hence, genetic engineering research is intimately connected to the interest structure and systems of meaning of various actors: farmers, scientists, industry, state, regulatory bodies, consumers and civil society and its organizations. In the sense, genetic engineering cannot be said it is not connected with society, it is not connected with the interests of various groups in the society. So, what are the interests of industry in producing genetically engineered food? In making, their interest primarily is to make profits, and in industry's meaning system, organisms are their parts or means of production. The industry recognizes or sees organisms only in terms of how one can use these organisms. They are seen as raw materials for production. Scientists' interests, they are interested in advancement of knowledge and patenting it, and in their meaning system, DNA is DNA whether it belongs to an animal, a plant or a bacterium, and transferable, and hence it is transferable. DNA is transferable from one organism to another organism, not only within a species but across species. Farmers' interests, they are interested in obtaining quality seed and enhancing productivity and marketability of the grain, and hence in consequence they want to make some profit out of this. Governments have to ensure food production and at the same time minimize risks and ensure safety of technology through regulatory bodies. That is the interest of the government. The government's job is to see that whatever people are consuming, people are using, people are cultivating is safe from point of view of consumers, environment and so on. So, let me give an example here. When first BT cotton was introduced in our country, it was not approved by the government. The company which produced or marketed this seed, BT cotton seed, surreptitiously or secretly passed on the seed to farmers, and the farmers started cultivating the seed, and once the crop has reached a level, the government realized that this was a genetically modified cotton seed, and some regulatory bodies suggested that this crop should be destroyed. This could not be done because no government would resort to this step, because it will antagonize the farmers, and the government will be in deep trouble. There will be political unrest. So, it is only after the introduction of BT cotton via this illegal means it was approved, and it was later, now over 80% of our cotton, 80% of our cotton is BT cotton. So, the interest of the consumers is health and safety of food, culturally mediated aesthetic considerations such as size of the grain, shape of the grain and color of the grain, taste and the meanings they attach to food and wider environment. As consumers, we all are interested in eating certain kinds of food grains. See, for example, at least in South, people want to eat rice which is white in color, longer in size and easy to cook and tastes better. And I am sure these kind of considerations are there across the country. For example, basmati rice is an example where people would like to consume it because of its size, its color and also aroma. So, we also attach meaning to food. We do not eat anything and everything. Every culture has identified certain things which can be, which are edible, certain things which are not edible, and certain things are supposed to be consumed only when there is scarcity of food grains and so on. Certain cultures prefer millets or rice and wheat, because in dryland areas only millets are cultivated and they grow under conditions of drought. So, transformation potential of genetic engineering, as we have seen, that it is intimately connected with the interests of the farmers, government, consumers, regulatory bodies and industry. Okay. Thus, genetic engineering technologies have a potential to transform nature on the one hand and social structure and culture on the other simultaneously, in the sense that it is no longer genetically modified seed is not merely a artifact or a product, it has wide ranging implications. For example, if some were to introduce genetically modified rice, people are going to ask several questions. So, these questions relate to the nature of genetic engineering technology and its control and its implications for human health and environment. Genetic modification of food crops has led to controversies based on economic, moral, religious and environmental considerations which are deeply implicated in values and meanings. See, what are these considerations like moral, religious considerations? See, some religions accept or approve of consuming certain kinds of foods. For example, among Muslims, consumption of pork is forbidden, and among Hindus, beef is prohibited kind of food, because historically people, at least the Hindus, found the cattle was important for an agrarian economy, and so cattle could not be consumed. So each cultures, each civilizations have evolved certain kinds of norms regarding food, like what is preferred food, what is permitted food, what is prohibited food. Okay. So these three norms are used in considering whether a particular substance can be consumed as food or not. So meanings means, I said, the people who attach meanings to as to what we consume as food, and aesthetic considerations like color, taste, size and so on. So these are values each culture holds, and people would like to see what they are consuming conforms or is compatible with their cultures of consumption. Before we go to that, one of the moral considerations raised by people who are opposing genetically modified food is that by genetically engineering food crops, we are playing God, we are behaving as if we are gods in changing nature. These groups say that we should not really resort to this kind of acts, because we are artificially transforming the genetic basis of a particular crop, and we should not do this. Similarly, environmental considerations are those. So what happens if a genetically modified crop is cultivated, what it does to non-human life forms, what it does to non-harmful or harmless insects that really feed on the food crop sometimes. So one example I can give you here is the Bt cotton seed. People have raised questions like, what if the cattle consumes the crop residues of Bt cotton plant? What happens to harmless insects which really feed on some cotton leaves and so on of the Bt cotton seed? So in the sense that people are asking these questions, so we have to have long-term studies on the implications or consequences of the genetically modified seed for the environment. So then, what are the other kinds of issues that that genetically modified food, genetic modification of food raises? Further, the nature seems to place constraints on genetic engineering technology. Most of the agronomic traits are controlled by more than one gene. Identifying and isolating whole complement of genes controlling a trait and transferring them is a difficult task. See, earlier people, the scientists at least, understood or considered or viewed that one trait is controlled by one gene. For example, the yield of a particular crop they thought is controlled by one particular gene, but that is not the case today. Scientists have really realized that yield is a parameter which is controlled by several genes. So if you really want to increase the yield of a particular crop, one has to, through genetic engineering, one has to bring in several kinds of genes into a particular crop, or transfer several genes into a particular seed of a particular crop. Second, the transgenes may flow to other plants of the same species and weeds. For example, flow of Bt gene or herbicide tolerant gene into weeds will make them super weeds, thus affecting the environment. See, there is a phenomenon called gene flow in the environment, and these genes can flow from one. This has happened in history, and this has happened recently also. See, this gave rise to several disputes. For example, in the United States, the GM company which sold the BT corn seed to farmer, one farmer cultivated BT corn, the next farmer cultivated organic corn, and the BT gene flew from the BT corn field to non-BT organic corn field. The companies tested the organic corn field and found that the BT gene was present in the organic corn crop. They said, our gene is present in your crop, so you have stolen our genes. This led to a kind of legal dispute and so on. Similarly, another kind of genetically engineered seed is herbicide tolerant gene, which is being introduced into plants. And recently, I read in Telangana state, illegally this herbicide tolerant seed was introduced to farmers, which is without approval of the regulatory bodies, without approval of the government of India. This can really create problems. For example, herbicide tolerant gene means it will kill all other small plants that grow along with this crop in which herbicide tolerant gene is present. See, in our country, in a typical field, agricultural field, several useful plants grow along with the crop plants. Now, this herbicide tolerant gene will eliminate all these useful plants that grow along with these crop plant. Okay, so I think what we are going to see is, if herbicide tolerant gene is going to be introduced into Indian agriculture, this has several implications. One has to really look at these. Third point, in nature both pests and hosts co-evolve. Pests develop resistance against the properties of the genes that have been introduced into the plant to fight pests or diseases. That is, we have seen in nature both host and the pest, they co-evolve. If the host plant, or that is genetically modified plant, is equipped with a toxin, the pests will try to adapt to the toxin or mutate to see that they develop resistance to these genes. So, in the context of BT cotton gene, we do not know how long the BT gene will confer resistance against pests. That is why the company producing the BT gene wants to sell to as many farmers in as many countries as possible. If you look at BT cotton seed, it is already the first generation BT cotton seed is supposed to be ineffective, because the pests have developed resistance against this toxin present in the BT cotton crop, and so they have to evolve second generation BT cotton plant, BT cotton seed, which has more genes, more toxic genes introduced into the crop. Let me also say something. When we talk of this resistance, one, we should really understand how long a particular gene is going to confer resistance against the pests. This has to be informed to the farmers. Scientists should say, okay, this is going to work for 3 years, 4 years, or maybe 5 years. After that, you must be ready for change over to another kind of a seed which will have more toxic genes and so on. That information is not given to the farmers. And the company which produced BT cotton seed in our country today removed all the first generation BT cotton seed, and you find only the second generation BT cotton seed in the market, and people say now there is a move to shift over to third generation. What are the risks of genetically modified food if it is consumed, or how does one look at risk? Risk is a potential harm to life, property and environment. There are two important dimensions of risk: A, judgment on acceptable level of risk; B, time element. Judgment on acceptable level of risk is never purely scientific. When the weighing of incommensurable costs and benefits involves trade-offs among diverse values. In the sense, whenever we decide on the levels of acceptable risk, it is not based on purely scientific analysis. The several values conflicting values are present, and the acceptable level is decided on the basis of a trade-off among diverse values of, for example, conflicting values like profit and safety, right? Profit and environmental safety, safety for human beings and so on. Hence, culture of regulation varies across countries. Trade-off depends on the context in which these decisions on acceptable level of risk are made. Time element, I just mentioned that the companies that develops the genetically modified seed should tell people how long this is going to work. Or, as I said, the crops are protected from pest attacks only for a certain number of years. That means after that the pests develop resistance, either by undergoing mutation or by adapting to the toxin I mentioned a few minutes ago. The culture of regulation or risk governance, different actors, scientists, government representatives, regulators, sometimes industry representatives evaluate risk from the vantage point of their own interests and meanings. Scientific judgments are not immune to social, political, industrial, cultural influences. That is, scientific judgments also have to factor in the considerations related to social, political, industrial and cultural influences. So, in the sense, what we call regulation should be based on some scientific judgments, and these scientific judgments are not really immune to influences from the wider society like social, political, industrial, cultural influences. Now, keeping in view this, if you look at acceptable level of risk, a decision on acceptable level of risk is always a negotiated outcome mediated by power relations among the actors and the institutions they represent. In this sense, acceptable level of risk is decided between two parties. It happens that one party represents the producers of this seed, example here, and other parties are consumers, civil society organizations, government and so on. Now, it depends on the outcome will depend on who wields more power. So, the industry may influence government, as I just now mentioned, the industry may influence scientists, and to see that the judgment on acceptable level of risk is not detrimental to the industrial interests. Secondly, time dimension refers to how long a particular technology is safe, I just mentioned. Regarding the time element, the question is what is the time frame over which, for example, Bt gene confers resistance against bollworm in view of the evolving nature of cotton plant and bollworm. I mentioned that cotton plant and bollworm are co-evolving organisms in nature. So, let's look at whether the regulation is same across the world, same across different countries, what are the variations in this culture of regulation. At present, we find that there are differences in the policy regimes, stakeholders' perspectives on genetic engineering and genetically modified food, and food preferences across the countries. We will present the cases of USA, Europe and India in the next. In this lecture, we are going to present cases of USA, Europe and India to see what is the variation in regulatory practices. United States of America, since the 1990s, the largest area of land in the United States of America has been devoted to genetically engineered crops, cotton, corn, soybean, including tomato. In the US, crops based on transgenic seed and crops based on conventional hybrid seed are treated substantially equivalent or treated as substantially equivalent. American people have been consuming genetically modified food, corn, soybean and so on. In the US, regulators tend to think that mandatory labeling would send a wrong signal, wrong message regarding the safety of genetically modified food and thus creating confusion among the consumers. That is why in the United States they don't label genetically modified food. It is part of the agricultural commodities and they are sold without any distinction between genetically modified food and food produced from other conventional techniques. In the US, we also see the phenomenon of revolving door. Industry representatives are also members of the regulating bodies. That means we can understand those people who have conflict of interest also represent the also are representatives on the regulating bodies. That's why we call it revolving door. When they are sitting in the committees, they have to represent certain interests, and then out of the committee they represent industrial interests. And when they are in the committee, they try to influence the committee to take decisions in their favor. However, there seems to be a tension between farmers cultivating transgenic corn and those cultivating organic corn due to flow of gene in the US, to which I made a reference earlier. So, if because of gene flow the farmer who grows organic corn, his field receives Bt gene because of the flow, the organic corn, if it has to be marketed, it has to be tested and certified that it is indeed an organic food and does not have genes from foreign sources and so on. If the farmer whose corn is supposed to be an organic corn, but it has Bt gene, this will be unfit for marketing. Nobody will buy this. They will not get a certification that the food is truly organic. In Europe, consumers and their organizations and civil society at large have been resisting genetic modification of food crops. Genetically modified food is perceived as unnatural and posing risks for human health and environment. According to the European Network on the Safety Assessment of Genetically Modified Food Crops, public concern is not only on risks but also questions such as who benefits, what are the needs, how does it contribute to sustainable agriculture. They are not merely raising questions regarding risk, but also they are raising questions, wider questions like who benefits out of the genetically modified food by producing food by genetic engineering, what are the needs of people, do we really need a genetically modified food, then how does it contribute to sustainable agriculture, does genetic modification of crops lead to sustainable agriculture. So, let me give an example here. See, sustainability means that we should not depend on one particular seed, one particular crop. In the sense, for example, if Bt cotton seed is going to be used, and ultimately we will see a day when only Bt cotton seed will be available in the market, but other seeds are out of the market, out of the use. That means we are narrowing down the kind of choices we have, and we have to depend on one particular kind of seed, which is not actually good from the point of view of sustainable development. Further, in Europe, labeling of food is insisted upon as a democratic right to know the ingredients of food that one consumes. The controversy remains to be resolved that the genetically modified GM companies or companies which produce GM food do not want to really have the label, whereas the consumers and the government insist that the companies must label their food as genetically modified food if it has been produced by genetic engineering techniques. This is seen as a barrier to export genetically modified food to Europe from US by biotech industry and the government of the US. There is always, as I said, it is not merely genetic modification of food, they also have commercial interests, economic interests. The Americans produce a lot of corn, enormous quantities of corn, which they want to export to other countries, including Europe, Europe has not been allowing imports of corn from the US without proper inspection, without proper kind of without proper norms regarding the levels of genetic ingredients that one finds in the US exports. See, what are the differences between USA and Europe in terms of perception among people about genetically modified food? There is an article according to Hebden, Shin and Holman 2004. They say the difference in the attitude of Americans vis-a-vis Europeans towards genetically modified food crops in terms of A, lack of exposure to information about GM food among the American consumers as compared to Europeans. B, separation of farmers or separation of farms physically and psychologically from urban centers in the US, where most of the population lives, and also the natural parks and other recreational areas in the US. So, the agricultural land is separated from urban habitations, they are separated from human habitations, they are separated from natural parks and so on, recreational areas and so on. That is why there is separation. See, the agriculture farms in the US are seen as out of the habitation area. In contrast, in Europe, farms are much smaller and situated closer to population centers and often adjacent to or in the midst of natural areas. It is in contrast to US. In the US, there is separation between nature and the farm in legal, physical and psychological senses, whereas in Europe, there is no such disjunction. Americans tend to place greater trust in the regulatory bodies such as the US Department of Agriculture and FDA compared to Europeans, Food and Drug Administration. Another article by Toke noticed that some people argue that in the American meaning system, food is seen as a fuel that is best according to its cheapness, while Europeans see food in terms of quality, cultural identity and food as identity marker. In India, genetically modified cotton seed is the only genetically modified seed that we have in the country. We do not have genetically modified food. So far, the government has not permitted cultivation of genetically modified food crops in our country. In India, the questions that are being asked regarding genetically modified food are similar to those raised in European context. In addition, the question of access to proprietary technology is important given the fact that the size of the land holding among the majority of the Indian farmers is less than 5 acres, whereas in the US the size of land holding can vary anywhere between 250 acres to 10,000 acres per individual household. The culture of regulation in India, the controversy regarding whether or not to introduce genetically modified food crops in India is yet to be resolved. Scientists are part of regulatory bodies, industry they work as lobbyists, the state represented by Minister of Environment and Forests, and of course farmers. These are the groups involved in, these are the groups which are going to be affected by the decisions on genetic modification of food, introduction of genetically modified food. And of course, CSOs are also involved. They also have been raising questions regarding the genetically modified food. See, the culture of alliance, BT brinjal, for example, we have seen that when the Monsanto company wanted to introduce BT brinjal in the country, there were several questions raised by public, because brinjal is a food crop. Brinjal is consumed by almost every region in the country. India is the second largest producer of brinjal, and brinjal is cooked almost regularly in every household in the country. So, there was this Minister for Environment and Forestry had consultations in 6 major cities, and one meeting was held in Hyderabad as well. This alliance between industry and farmers, alliance between farmers and CSOs, one could see this alliance, and the Minister for Environment and Forests, on the basis of the public hearings and on the basis of his own input, on the basis of inputs that he got from scientists from across the world, he decided that we should not really decide on the commercial introduction of Bt brinjal at this stage, and that decision has been deferred by imposing a moratorium on commercial introduction of Bt brinjal. So, how does the regulatory system work? Theory of state in democracy says, some people say it is an agency of the bourgeoisie, that is, the state represents interests of capitalists. B, completely autonomous, that state does not give privilege to any section of the society, and C is relatively autonomous. In the US, if you see, the state is active promoter of GM food, and that is why the state itself is in favor of GM food. In European countries, the state is made to listen to people, show its relative autonomy. Europe, they say that state should not take unilateral decisions, they must consult people before taking such crucial decisions as introduction of genetically modified food. The state in India also can be seen sometimes relatively autonomous. Environmental issues seem to force us to revisit the theory of state again. In India, we have seen the state agencies, we do not know how they operate. Sometimes they favor industrial interests, sometimes they say that they are in favor of taking decisions that do not affect the public at large and so on. So, we have to really see what. So, it is in this context, while we cannot dismiss new knowledge, while we cannot say that we do not want any new knowledge, we should see how to use new knowledge which really is accessible to all people. In this context, marker assisted selection technology based on genomics, that is modern biology. Genomics is the science of genes, offers an alternative to genetic engineering. The MAS involves transfer of genes from one variety to another variety within a species or within the primary gene pool of a particular crop. This is not controversial and it may be developed in a non-proprietary and open source mode before resorting to genetic engineering. Genes in the primary gene pool of a particular crop have to be explored fully to find out the variability for the purpose of improving crops and specific types within a particular crop. Conclusion: the context dependent nature of food production and culturally mediated food preferences pose challenges to the view that it is possible to develop one technology for all contexts. So, I think the debate on genetic engineering of food has not really ended, it is still on. Today again, as I said earlier in the lecture, there were reports in Telangana in newspapers that in Telangana state the herbicide tolerant gene was introduced into crops, which has not been really approved by the regulatory bodies, which the government has not decided on introduction of the herbicide tolerant genes into our agriculture. This has to be debated. This has to be what kind of decision the government will take regarding the herbicide tolerant genes that have been illegally introduced into the agriculture in our country. So, innovations, of course, as I said, we should not really dismiss new knowledge. Innovations based on new knowledge have to be socially acceptable in terms of safety, equity and sustainability, environmental safety and cultural considerations mentioned above. In order to produce such innovations, stakeholders should be involved from the beginning of the innovation process as co-participants and incorporate their perspectives in the innovation process. It is now recognized that many solutions are needed in different contexts rather than one solution for all contexts. It is in this situation the participation of the users of technology also should be made co-participants in the development of new technology. Coexistence of multiplicity of knowledge systems requires recognition of cognitive justice. And in order to understand plurality of knowledge systems, cognitive empathy may be useful as a methodological heuristic. This talk is based on manuscript Genetically Modified Food published in Blackwell Encyclopedia of Globalization, edited by George Ritzer. I mean, it's been published, I should update this. As part of the public consultation process on the commercial introduction of BT brinjal, the public demanded a precautionary approach, which is part of the principle 15 of the Cartagena Protocol, to which India is a signatory, and demanded an upstream public engagement prior to the approval of genetically modified brinjal. The state governments which responded to the Ministry of Environment Forests for their views on commercial release of BT brinjal, the majority of the state governments said no to the proposal of commercial introduction of BT brinjal. So, the culture of alliance on BT brinjal, the public hearings in 6 cities by the Minister of Environment and Forests. As I said, Hyderabad also there was a meeting, one of the meeting was held in Hyderabad as well. The alliance between farmers and industry was one group, alliance between farmers and civil society organizations another group, and consumers constituted the participants in the public hearings. See, the moratorium on commercial introduction of BT brinjal really to democratized the role of the state in regulation, democratized the process of regulation, and that is how, because of a large section of society participating in the debate on the commercial introduction of BT brinjal, ultimately the Minister of Environment and Forests took a decision to impose a moratorium on the commercial introduction of BT brinjal until further research is carried out on safety issues, issues relating to the kind of impact it will have on the environment, and so that is how the decision on the commercial introduction of BT brinjal was made. One more genetically modified crop has been approved by the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee of the Ministry of Environment and Forests, and that crop is mustard crop. See, we all know mustard is extensively used in India as a cooking medium, as a cooking oil, as oil for for various purposes, for personal use, personal hygiene and so on. And this is an important cooking oil also in West Bengal, in Bengal and other states, and this has extremely this is a high level of demand for mustard oil in our country. So, Delhi University Deepak Pental, who was also the former Vice Chancellor of the university, his research group developed or introduced 2 genes from the Bacillus liquefacens. These genes are called Barnes and Barstar. 2 genes were introduced into mustard crop, and this 2 genes will help in hybridization of self-pollinating crop, that is mustard. Mustard is a self-pollinating crop like rice, and we know that rice hybrids have been developed in our country for the last 20 years, and China is the country which pioneered the development of rice hybrids, and India has the credit of developing cotton hybrids. Okay. See, as I said, conventionally self-pollinating crops such as rice, hybrid seeds are produced by a technique called CMS, that is cytoplasmic male sterility technique. This is pioneered by Chinese hybrid technology and is being used in India also. In mustard, it's also a self-pollinating crop. The CMS system has been used to develop hybrids, but now Professor Deepak Pental's group says we should move over to a genetically modified way of producing hybrids, and this genetic modification is carried out is done by introducing 2 genes, that is Barnes and Barstar from the bacterium. So, the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee of the Ministry of Environment and Forests recommended for the commercial introduction of genetically modified mustard in May 2017. However, the Environment Ministry did not approve of the recommendations of the GESC in view of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Science and Technology and Environment and Forests initiative to examine the issue of GM crops and its environmental impacts. After a number of civil society groups in commercial introduction of GM mustard. Now again we are going to perhaps see the same kind of a debate that has taken place with respect to BT brinjal will also be revived, and it will go on. Same kind of issues will be raised because GM genetically modified mustard is a food crop, and if genetically modified mustard is allowed, then there may be a lot more genetically modified food crops that are going to come into our agriculture. So I think the debate is, we should decide what is wrong with producing hybrid mustards using the CMS technology, the earlier conventional CMS techniques. Why should we move into genetic engineering of genetically engineered mustard to produce hybrids? So one argument that is given by Pentel's group is that according to earlier techniques, by using CMS techniques, there is a limitation on producing number of hybrid seeds, and whereas this genetically modified mustard will act as a platform to produce many more kinds of hybrids, and that's how it should be allowed according to Deepak Pentel. But the same kind of a consideration that we really discussed in the context of BT brinjal can be again brought into discussion here, can be brought to the table here for discussion in terms of moral considerations, whether GM mustard, genetic engineering of GM mustard is morally right, or are we playing the god, and whether genetic modification of mustard is going to be socially and culturally acceptable, because there is a microbe, there is a bacterium inside put in the mustard seed, whether people will accept it socially. That's another question that we should really ask. See, sometimes there can be a situation where we have to see whether only yield becomes important parameter or other considerations. So I think one should also look at other considerations. Only then a hybrid crop becomes successful. Let me give an example from hybrid rice. Hybrid rice is produced in India for last 20 years, but in the hybrid rice program was supposed to be introduced in traditionally rice growing areas in southern India like Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Punjab, Haryana and so on, UP to some extent. But in South India there are few takers for hybrid rice, because hybrid rice is sticky when it is cooked and shelf life of hybrid rice is not long. So on these considerations, in South India hybrid rice has not become popular. So of course in states like Jharkhand, hybrid rice has become popular because there they don't have this kind of aesthetic considerations of rice, the grain should be long, white and so on. So they don't have problem with sticky rice. Similarly, Chinese may not have problem with sticky rice because they use chopsticks to eat rice. So I think these considerations are also important when we take a decision on a particular crop, and especially the mustard crop again raised a lot of debate in the country. Now that's why the commercial release of the mustard crop is deferred according to the Minister of Environment and Forests, although the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee recommended for its commercial introduction. Now it's also, one has to find out what is are there any IPR issues in using this Barnes-Barsar system, these two genes. There is one more gene called Bar gene. Bar gene is a proprietary gene produced by some which has several patents under patents. There are several patents underlying the production of bar gene, and bar gene is a proprietary product. So one has to look into this aspect also, whether the Barnes Barstar genes have any proper IPR issues. Who controls these genes? So this is an important question. This will really this is going to be important in fixing the cost of the mustard seed if it is ever released, genetically engineered mustard seed if it is ever released. So should we go in for genetically modified mustard or not? That's the question. And what is the kind of shortage of mustard in the country today? If people complained of shortage of mustard oil, then we should explore the possibility of producing it in a very different way. So I think these are the questions one has to keep in mind when we really when the government decides on the commercial introduction of mustard. So I think there are several issues. We are moving into an era. We talked about green revolution earlier. Now we are moving to gene revolution. Green revolution, although it really enhanced the yield, it has created several unintended consequences, like for example increasing soil salinity in some regions, increasing pesticide residues in the soil and in the food, and several consequences have been reported because of the green revolution in the areas in which the green revolution was in vogue for nearly 60 years. So I think these are the considerations which we also should use in looking at the introduction of genetically modified mustard. What are the implications for health of people, implications for environment, implications for the cattle population, implications for the harmless insects and so on. These are important considerations, because in our country cattle are integral part of our farming. They are very much part of our farming systems. So they also eat the residues of crop plants, and we will let see what are the consequences of this kind of shift, that if it ever takes place, we have to look at these issues before we decide on this. Thank you very much.